Everyone, so today I will be going over whether the Reformation would have succeeded without the printing press. So, pre Gutenberg Europe, there were only a few books. They were mostly in Latin and possessed by the church and aristocracy. So, um, a lot of the a lot of people didn't have access to books. In addition to that, the population was illiterate. It was a very oral culture. Priests would announce news at church. The local priests usually would not own a Bible either, so it's only the top priests that would own it. The villagers would listen to a traveling reader. There were no schools except for the elites. It was a feudal society, and the information was controlled by the church and aristocracy. So as we can see, a lot of people didn't have access to books or education, and so result they had to resolve to listening to authority and just trusting that the authority was leading them in the way that they needed to go. However, following the printing press, a lot of this began to change. Overall, the printing press led to advancement in critical thinking, church reformation ideas, literacy in schools, and nationalism, such as language and cultural identity. So, the printing press made it possible to produce a large number of books, exact copies, in a short amount of time. The church didn't really like this. They ignored it for aesthetic reasons and refused to place hand copied books alongside printed books. They didn't really like that people were beginning to have more access to information. The printing press led to people beginning to discover contradictions among texts, and this began to affect thinking and perception. In addition to this, the traditional power structures began to be challenged, so people began to because people began to realize the contradictions in the text, they began to challenge people of authority, which eventually led to the Reformation. Overall, the church began to lose its absolute authority as the idea of individualism began to increase. So, the printing press helped to elevate the status of the individual, which meant that they began to promote the idea that any person could have their own opinion. So they didn't have to resolve to the church's opinion, but instead could create their own. The printing press was affecting the pace and intensity of intellectual exchange all throughout Europe by the end of the 15th century, and that is on page 174 of the book. So from this, we can see that the printing press led to significant changes, and these are the kind of changes that helped aid Luther in establishing his arguments, which eventually led to the Reformation. So Luther really used the printing press to his advantage. He utilized the utilizing of the printing press paved the way for the Reformation. From the book, it reads, "The torrent of words that flowed from Luther's pen represented a marvel in his age and became a treasure for study thereafter, especially in recent times, as more complete editions of Luther's works have become readily available." And this is on page 152. Overall, the work of Luther provided much of the bulk that was laid on the table at Worms during the confrontation with Charles V, found from page 152 of the book. Because of his writings, it affected, like what was previously mentioned, the um, the argument at Worms and confrontation with Charles V. Luther published a lot of books. For example, he published hymns, poetry, the translation of the entire Bible in German, Small Catechism in 1529, Bible commentaries, letters, sermons, devotionals, and more. He really utilized the printing press in order to spread information and really just explain his argument and help people understand what he was trying to say, what he was explaining. And his argument was to challenge the authority of the church by arguing that scripture had the most authority, the centrality of the reason, and the importance of personal conscience. So he really challenged um, the role of authority in the church and argued that individuals should be able to make decisions on their personal conscience and not what the whole church declares. Luther's ideas most likely would not have been able to spread as widely were the printing press to not have existed. It allowed him to produced a large number of books in a short amount of time. In addition to that, common people had access to information. So because he was arguing that that people should be able to make decisions on personal conscience, people began to gravitate towards that, and they began to agree with his work, and from that he gained more support. People began to discover contradictions among texts, and this began to affect thinking and perception. So they began to listen to what Luther was saying and take it in for themselves, and they realized that they could make their own decisions as opposed to always listening to the church. Overall, the printing press helped to elevate the status of the individual and allow them to make their own opinion. At the time, John Huss began to speak up against the argument of Luther. He was a Czech reformer in 1415, and he advocated the authority of the Bible, the local church autonomy, spiritual reform, and questioning of church decrees. However, he was declared heretic and was burned alive because the church did not agree with his argument, and therefore he was declared a heretic. However, compared to Luther, who argued the authority of Scripture, centrality of reason, and the importance of personal conscience, people began to favor his argument more and realized from that that they were able to make decisions and didn't have to always follow what the church said, because sometimes the church did not exactly interpret information in the way that they should have. And so this created the freedom for people to speak up and think for themselves. So some may argue that the Reformation could have succeeded without the printing press, considering the fact that that Luther had other ways of arguing, which included speaking up in the church and talking to people of authority and explaining his argument in that way. However, this wouldn't have been as effective, considering the fact that his argument appealed more to the common people solely for the fact that it challenged the authority of the church and also allowed for an increase in individual thought. And this is exactly what the printing press led to, allowed for people to actually think for themselves, as mentioned previously. In addition to that, Luther published most of his works via the printing press as opposed to public speaking. So a lot of his work was done through writings and poems and devotionals and things of that sort. Thus, it becomes evident that through the fact that Luther's argument appealed more to the common people, the printing press did indeed allow the Reformation to succeed. Thank you for watching.